Today's video is brought to you by Squarespace. More on them in just a bit. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty is one of those dusty old documents that nobody thinks about on a day-to-day basis. But when asked, just about everybody is grateful that it exists. Ratified or signed by 199 countries, the treaty forbids the deployment of weapons of mass destruction in space, including nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. Signatories promise to avoid placing any WMD in orbit, installing them on any space stations or celestial bodies, or establishing any kind of military base or presence on the moon or elsewhere. The treaty is written to emphasize again and again that space is a peaceful place, and many experts believe that the treaty is best interpreted as a total prohibition on the transport of earthly weapons out into the cosmos. It is a vitally important treaty, one that has ensured that there will be no war fought over the moon, no massive Space Force bases orbiting 400 kilometers skyward, and no satellites packed full of nuclear warheads pointed at Washington, Moscow, London, Beijing, or anywhere else on Earth. But the treaty also contains something else, something the writers probably would have avoided in hindsight, and that's wiggle room. Though the treaty may be written in the spirit of a total ban on weapons in space, it doesn't say so outright. It just bans certain weapon systems and military actions. And here, in this diplomatic grey area, we find our topic for today's video: Kinetic Orbital Bombardment, better known as the rods from God. Orbital bombardment as a broad concept is fairly simple to understand. Take a weapon system into space, pointed at Earth, and launch away. If you want to bring devastation on your geopolitical rival, orbital bombardment seems to offer a number of advantages. You can get a satellite much closer to an enemy nation than your missile silos. You can launch missiles that existing missile defense systems would have a hard time detecting before it's too late. And if you want to make threats instead of making war, you can simply position your orbital bombardment satellite above an enemy nation and just wait for them to cave. Historically, orbital bombardment is often imagined using nuclear warheads, and the Soviet Union actually developed and deployed a disarmed version of this, the fractional orbital bombardment system, into space from 1968 to 1983. And we've actually done a separate video all about that if you'd like to learn more. But while an arms version of the fractional orbital bombardment system would have been a violation of the Outer Space Treaty, there are other types of orbital bombardment systems that are theoretically legal under international law, and this is where the rods from God come in. The design and execution of this sort of weapon can vary, but we'll go with the United States' design, which we'll discuss in greater detail soon, to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. Take a kinetic projectile or hypervelocity rod, in this case a tungsten rod of 20 feet long by 1 foot in diameter. That's 6 meters by 30 centimeters for those who believe in a rational system of measurement. It's made out of tungsten due to the element's insanely high melting point, over 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, well beyond the heat generated by atmospheric re-entry. Don't bother to attach explosives to this telephone pole-sized tungsten spear, though. You won't need them. Don't bother to make it radioactive either. You'll do just fine without having to violate the Outer Space Treaty at all. Just point it at whatever city, military installation, or secret bunker you want and launch away. The destructive power of the rods from God come from their kinetic energy, and at least on paper, they get the job done. A tungsten rod of that size can move at 8 kilometers per second. That's 24 times the speed of sound while in orbit, and though it will lose some of its velocity upon its descent to Earth, it'll still be traveling at almost 9 times the speed of sound. That's 3 kilometers per second when it hits the ground at sea level. The impact of this telephone pole from hell produces as much energy as 11.5 tons of TNT, enough to devastate parts of a city or pierce even the deepest of underground bunkers. Again, this is with no conventional explosives, no nuclear blast, just a whole lot of tungsten and a little bit of help from gravity. Of course, in order to launch these rods from space, you got to first get them into space, and as any astrophysicist, rocket scientist, or owner of a NASA t-shirt will tell you, that's a very tall order. At $230 million to transport each rod into space, it almost would seem cheaper and easier to get 11.5 actual tons of TNT to an enemy nation than it is to lug a tungsten telephone pole into space. In order to be worth considering at all, the rods from God must have some additional strategic or tactical value, and, well, do they ever. Since a kinetic bombardment weapon like this is launched from orbit, it would take less than half the time of an ICBM to impact its target, and enemy nations would be unable to detect its launch using any existing monitoring systems. They could be used anywhere around the world, assuming their launch satellite could be positioned within orbit as needed, and with such a high velocity during atmospheric entry, well, good luck trying to shoot it out of the sky on the way down. Alright, I'll interrupt today's video to tell you about a sponsor that you've never heard before, Squarespace. Just joking, of course you've heard of Squarespace. They are one of the most loyal, regular, beloved sponsors on this channel. And look, maybe you've got some idea for a new website that you want to create. Maybe you've got a blog, you've got opinions that you want to share and annoy people with, or maybe you've got a brilliant idea for some business which is going to sell something. Yes, Squarespace do stores, but look, it can be daunting to get all of this started because you're like, ooh, the internet, where do I go? What do I do? Don't worry, worried person. Just head over to Squarespace, there's a link below, by the way, and they will guide you through everything. So when you go to Squarespace, you'll see that there are a load of templates that you get to choose from, and you're like, ooh, I like the look of that one. And you go in there, it's got like generic photos, and it's got Lorem Ipsum, and you're like, cool. You grab that, you take that out, you put in your own photo, you just click upload from your computer. It's ridiculously easy. You type some stuff in, you move it around, it's all drag and drop, and then you click done. And you are done. You will be done with your website, even if you know nothing about websites, in less than an afternoon. It is that easy. And you can also add in a bunch of stuff, like you want a contact form so people can come to your website and be like, oh, I'd like to contact them about the thing. Boom, do that. And you don't have to have your email out there in the wilds of the internet. They've also got loads of other stuff to help you out, 24/7 customer support, mailing lists, the list goes on. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/megaprojects. You're at 10% of your first purchase of a website or a domain, and let's get back into it. The history of gravitational bombardment goes back to the Korean and Vietnam Wars, when the United States Air Force developed and deployed a limited number of lazy dog bombs. These bombs comprised 2-inch long, 1/2-inch thick cylinders of solid steel, again with no explosives, radioactive components, or any other bells and whistles except some guidance fins. Dropped from thousands of feet in the air, these cylinders could penetrate 9 inches of concrete upon impact, basically functioning the same way that a machine gun might have fired straight down at the ground. In the 1950s, Boeing scientist Jerry Pournelle was the first to introduce the idea of large tungsten poles as kinetic bombardment projectiles launched from orbit toward the Earth. And in the 1980s, scientists Lowell Wood and Edward Teller proposed a missile defense system operating on a similar concept. This system, codenamed Brilliant Pebbles, would place thousands of small missiles into orbit above the Soviet Union in order to strike and disable intercontinental ballistic missiles as they were launched into orbit. The project was briefly pursued by the United States, but was cancelled in 1993. And do let us know in the comments if you'd like a separate video on all of those brilliant pebbles. The closest the rods from God ever came to reality, though, was in the design put forth by the United States that we referenced a little bit earlier. Described in a 2003 United States Air Force report as the hypervelocity rod bundle system, this proposal used the weapon iteration that we described in detail. 20-foot-long tungsten telephone poles loaded onto satellites orbiting the planet and capable of striking anywhere in the world. Designed for use similar to tactical nuclear warheads, which we've also made a recent video about on our Warographics channel, the structure of the rods made them optimal for bunker busting and the elimination of other well-fortified or underground targets. This was particularly relevant at the time it was proposed under the Bush administration, when theoretical weapons of mass destruction kept deep in Iraqi labs and bunkers were still used as the pretense for America's ongoing invasion there. Of course, the hypervelocity rod bundle system was never put into production, but their inclusion in a well-published military report was certainly not an accident. In fiction, too, the concept of kinetic bombardment has gotten its fair share of use, beginning with the 1960s short stories that sought to understand the implications of humankind's entry into space. The television series Babylon 5, the movie Starship Troopers, Neil Stephenson's novel Anthem, the video games Halo, Mass Effect 2, and Call of Duty Ghosts, and even a 2003 G.I. Joe film, have all referenced the tactic, with varying levels of resemblance to the rods from God themselves. Since its 2003 report, the US military appears to have moved on from orbital bombardment, although it continues to explore the use of kinetic energy weapons. A 2012 statement from the Office of Naval Research referenced a hypervelocity projectile weapon, a railgun, that uses the same basic principles of physics as the rods from God, and weapons developers have continued to discuss the value of kinetic energy projectiles. And although it's not a part of the United States government, a subsidiary of defense contractor Northrop Grumman has designed a partially 3D printed warhead that can withstand atmospheric travel at hypersonic speed, bringing up a range of potential implications for possible alternatives to tungsten that could conceivably survive the heat and friction of atmospheric entry while not being nearly as expensive to transport to space in the first place. The most recent developments in kinetic bombardment technology, though, haven't come out of the United States at all. Instead, it's been China that has generated headlines in the last few years after the release of 2018 test footage that depicted a prototype weapon system with some clear resemblance to the rods from God concept. In the test, 3-pointed projectiles were dropped from a high-altitude balloon, breaking the sound barrier on their descent before deploying parachutes and coming down safely to the ground. At the time, the wide-area, winged, and highly aerodynamic design of the projectile led analysts to believe that this was a test for China's program to build a hypersonic aircraft. But a 2021 report by the Financial Times revealed that a Chinese hypersonic weapon system had indeed entered orbit to fully circle the globe. Similar to the fractional orbital bombardment system that we mentioned earlier, the Chinese weapons system is believed to be a platform to launch nuclear warheads toward Earth from space. And this expectation has guided most analysis around the issue. But for what it's worth, and we should mention that this is simply educated speculation on our part, there's simply no guarantee about what the Chinese orbiter's payload will be, or even whether the orbiter itself might be the payload. After all, China won't be giving out such information, and anything other nations do know about its orbital ambitions is most likely going to be kept highly classified. The Boeing scientist who first introduced the concept of kinetic orbital bombardment, Jerry Pournelle, spent much of his early life as an award-winning science fiction writer. And when asked about the weapons system in his twilight years, Pournelle made an astute observation. The concept had been out in the world since the 1950s, right there for anyone to use. But every few decades, it almost seemed as if somebody rediscovered the idea before it was forgotten again. We at Megaproject certainly can't predict the future, but if we had to take our best guess, it seems more likely than anything that the rods from God will continue as they have always done, gradually fading from public consciousness, then resurfacing once again, and then fading once again. The concept is expensive, it's impractical, and as human development of hypersonic weapons continues to advance, it seems as if the classical vision of the rods from God is close to being relegated to the same heap of antiquated fiction that once promised flying skateboards and in-home robot maids by the year 2000. Perhaps as defense technology continues to develop, space-mounted lasers or particle beams will slide into the role for which the rods from God were conceived. But for as long as the Outer Space Treaty continues to hold, and as long as humans struggle to answer our great collective nuclear problem, it seems unlikely that kinetic orbital bombardment weapons will ever really, truly be off the table.